The stories presented in this video are real, but we have changed the characters' names and altered images to protect their identities. The creator of this video is not an investigative officer. These narratives have been sourced from various internet platforms. Our intent is not to accuse or target anyone in particular. Thank you for understanding.
A seemingly normal family in a small Alabama town was hiding a sinister secret. An unsettling affair between her husband and his half-sister is discovered by a loyal wife, setting off a series of events that culminate in murder, betrayal, and a trial that shocks the neighborhood. This eerie tale of love, deceit, and the terrible results of suppressed impulses is told. Welcome to True Crime Stories Hub, your daily source for gripping true crime documentaries. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an intense and shocking new family betrayal stories only here at True Crime Stories Hub. It was a calm summer in rural Alabama in 2006. At the end of a rural lane dotted with massive oak trees stood the Wallace family home. Susan frequently sat on the wraparound porch in the evenings, sipping iced tea as their kids played in the yard. The house was simple but cozy, with pale blue shutters. The Wallace family appeared to be picture-perfect from the outside. The center of the household was 30-year-old Susan Wallace. She was a dedicated housewife who enjoyed the simple things in life, like making clothes for her kids, baking pies for the church's fundraiser, and keeping the house tidy. She was a caring person who always put the needs of others before her own. She was raised in a loving but strict home where her parents instilled in her the importance of dedication and hard work. She was proud of her marriage to Mark and felt they had established a solid, unshakable foundation. The family's 35-year-old breadwinner was Mark Wallace. He was a talented mechanic who put in a lot of overtime at the neighborhood repair shop. He seemed to share Susan's family values and was calm and trustworthy. Although Mark appeared to be a family-oriented man to the outer world, no one, not even Susan, fully comprehended the complexity of his history. His father's adultery had cast a shadow on Mark's upbringing. Lila Carter was born as a result of a brief liaison between his father, a guy with a wandering eye. Although there were rumors of Lila in the little Alabama town, Mark's family mostly ignored her existence. Neither the affair nor the child it produced were acknowledged by Mark's haughty and unyielding mother. Mark didn't communicate with Lila for years when she and her mother relocated to a different place. When Mark turned 17, everything changed. The two half-siblings first met when Lila's mother took her to Mark's village. Mark was calm and disciplined, whereas Lila, who was just 15 at the time, was brazen and rebellious. Their bond was instantaneous, but anything but typical. Mark, who had grown up longing for a closer connection in his broken family, was enthralled with her untamed energy, and Lila was pulled to his stability. As they grew older, what had started off as a harmless sibling friendship took a sinister turn. Their connection had crossed lines that ought to have stayed unbroken by the time Mark was 19. Unspoken but never forgotten, it was a secret they both carried into adulthood. Mark thought that phase of his life was over when he married Susan at the age of 27. Mark's meticulously planned life started to fall apart in 2010. Mark got a surprise letter from Lila one cool autumn afternoon. It was through shared family ties that she had discovered his address. The letter was ambiguous but heartfelt, filled of regret and longing. Lila asserted that she desired resolution, to finally discuss their history and move on. Despite his hesitation, Mark was unable to resist the allure of unresolved business. He remembered Lila as a wild adolescent, but she had changed by the time they met at a diner on the outskirts of town. At 33, she was imposing, self-assured, and exuded a commanding and seductive air of authority. As the result of an affair, she talked about her difficulties, failed relationships, a job that hadn't taken off, and a persistent sense of displacement. What started out as a harmless encounter soon changed. Lila leaned into the unresolved tension between them as they reflected on their shared past. Even though he knew better, Mark couldn't help himself. That day the affair was reignited, a decision that would have disastrous repercussions throughout their lives. Mark and Lila continued their affair covertly for several months. In order to avoid leaving any evidence, they met at motels outside of town. Fueled by years of repressed feelings and the excitement of the forbidden, their relationship was passionate. It was turbulent, though. The manipulative side of Lila started to show. She became envious of Mark's life with Susan and wanted his attention. Conversely, Mark was tormented with guilt. Despite his intense love for Susan and their kids, he was unable to break his toxic relationship with Lila. Playing on his vulnerabilities and their common past, Lila would draw him back in each time he made a self-promise that it would be the last. Susan started to notice Mark's alterations in early 2011. He began arriving home late, claiming to have worked more shifts. Their previously animated chats became uncomfortable and brief because he was aloof and frequently preoccupied. Some evenings, after supper, he would go to the garage and completely avoid touching her. On a soggy afternoon in March 2011, Susan reached her breaking point. She discovered a crumpled receipt in Mark's jeans pocket while washing laundry. It was from a nearby town's motel and was dated only a week earlier. She initially attempted to ignore it. He might have come there to assist a friend or for employment, but she had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. Susan started to piece things together over the course of the following few days. She observed how Mark would go outdoors to answer calls and how his phone would buzz at strange hours. Susan couldn't help but check Mark's phone one evening while he was taking a shower. Her world was destroyed by what she discovered. A series of texts from a woman named Lila, some of which were flirty and others of which specifically described their encounters. Susan confronted Mark late on March 20, 2011. She quietly put his phone on the kitchen table, open to the messages, after waiting until the kids were asleep. At first, Mark insisted Lila was merely an old family friend and denied everything. However, Mark's facade broke down when Susan pressed him, her voice trembling with sadness and anger. Although he admitted to the affair, he omitted the most startling information. Mark didn't tell Susan the truth until she insisted on knowing how he knew Lila. Lila was his half-sister in addition to being his lover. Susan's response was one of disgust and incredulity. Her whole marriage seems to have been a deception to her. The man she believed to be familiar was concealing something so sinister and unfathomable. That night, Susan didn't sleep. Gazing at pictures of their family, she sat at the kitchen table, trying to figure out how Mark could have betrayed her in this way. She had decided by morning. She felt that the truth had to be revealed for her own peace of mind and her family's protection. Therefore, she would do whatever it took to expose the affair. Susan was unable to predict the disastrous series of events that would follow her choice. What would come next? No one could have predicted how terrible the answer would be. The fall of the Wallace family started in the living room of Mark and Susan's little Alabama home on a Sunday night in June 2011. Susan had been struggling with Mark's treachery for weeks. Unsure whether to reveal the truth or keep the affair a secret for the benefit of their kids, she wavered between anger and sadness. Finally, her rage prevailed, stoked by Lila's growing confidence. Lila had begun leaving mysterious voicemails, practically mocking Susan, saying that she and Mark had a connection that no one could ever sever. Susan concluded that the truth could not be kept hidden. She summoned her parents, Mark's parents, and Lila herself to a family gathering. The meeting was held in the Wallace residence on a muggy evening, and tension was in the air before anyone had uttered a word. Unaware that a family storm was building, the kids had been taken to spend the night at Susan's sister's house. Susan revealed everything to the family when they assembled. She described the months of treachery she had discovered and the terrible reality of Lila and Mark's relationship in a cool but methodical manner. Lila smirked boldly, seemingly proud of the destruction she had sowed, while Mark sat in quiet, his face white. Their parents were struck like a tidal wave by the discovery. Mark's mother, a proud woman who had been unaware of Lila's existence for decades, started crying. In addition to Mark's betrayal of Susan, she was saddened to learn that her husband's adultery had caused such a terrible circumstance. Mark's father sat stiffly, looking at the floor, his face displaying his guilt over the family's shattered history. However, Lila's mother became enraged and reacted angrily. She refused to accept that Lila had voluntarily resumed the romance and instead blamed Mark for corrupting her daughter. As accusations flew and voices overlapped, the room fell into anarchy. But Lila stayed eerily composed. She asserted that she and Mark were soulmates and that their bond went beyond morals and familial ties. Her boldness astounded everyone. Mark tried desperately to save his marriage in the days that followed. He pleaded with Susan for forgiveness and vowed to never again interact with Lila. He vowed never to see Lila again and even went so far as to ban her number. However, Susan's trust was irreparably damaged. She was unable to forget the violation of her promises or remove the picture of Mark and Lila together. Susan spent a lot of time on the phone with her parents and sister, seeking encouragement from her family. Even though she was very troubled by the idea of severing her family, she started talking about separation. She was overcome by the emotional upheaval. Her days were occupied with the tiresome duty of acting as though nothing was wrong for the benefit of her kids, while her nights were restless and her mind was racing with ideas of what had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Lila wouldn't let Mark leave. Believing that Susan was the only thing preventing her from being happy, she developed an obsession. She started calling Susan and left hateful and threatening messages. At times, the calls were begging Susan to take a back seat. At other occasions, Lila accused Susan of being unworthy of Mark, and they were threatening. The abuse continued after that. Lila began loitering around the Wallace residence, showing up without permission. At strange hours, neighbors saw her car parked on the street. Lila was once seen by Susan standing at the side of their driveway, gazing at the house with a disturbing intensity. Lila refused to believe that Mark had chosen his family over her and continued to find ways to get involved in their life despite his attempts to cut her off. Early in 2012, Susan's anxiety started to increase. She began to always lock the doors and even thought about requesting a restraining order. In the silence, though, she wondered if she was exaggerating. Lila had not yet hurt anyone physically, after all. Nevertheless, there was a noticeable sense of tension in the Wallace home. Torn between guilt and worry of what Lila could do next, Mark was always on edge. For the benefit of her kids, Susan attempted to keep herself together. March 6, 2012, began like any other morning. Susan had organized a day of errands and housework since she was now living in silent defiance of the mayhem going on around her. The house was unusually quiet, and the kids were in school. But everything would be different by noon. Mrs. Albright, a neighbor, noticed something strange around 10:42 a.m. The Wallace house's front door stood open, swaying softly in the wind. Although retired teacher Mrs. Albright found it strange, she didn't look into it right away. Alarms weren't sounded until 12:15 p.m., when Susan neglected to pick up her youngest child from school. The cops reached the Wallace residence about 1:30 p.m. What they found was a terrible scenario. The body of Susan was discovered in a pool of blood in the living room. There were indications of a struggle, and her throat had been cut. Overturned furniture. The floor was littered with broken glass. A crime of passion was suggested by the crime scene. Given how intimate the violence was, it was obvious that the murderer's actions were motivated by strong feelings. Although the residence had been looted, nothing of great worth seemed to be gone, according to the police. This was not a break-in. The attack was targeted. There were multiple missed calls from an unidentified number on Susan's phone, which was still resting on the kitchen counter. The police had started to piece together what had happened before the murder by March 8, 2012. Mark was interrogated. His co-workers confirmed his alibi, which stated that he had been at work that morning. But he was a figure of interest because of his relationship with Lila. The focus soon turned to Lila. In the days preceding the murder, neighbors saw her automobile close to the Wallace residence, and a number of them brought up her unpredictable conduct in the previous several months. A notebook with compulsive ramblings about Mark, Susan, and their family was discovered by the police after obtaining an order to investigate her flat. The investigation took a sharp turn on March 12, 2012. Lila vanished. As though she had escaped quickly, her apartment remained undisturbed. Later that night, her automobile was discovered abandoned close to the Alabama-Georgia state line, raising suspicions that she was trying to flee. The tragedy involving the Wallace family had rocked the tiny Alabama community to its foundation. The sudden and tragic death of Susan left her children completely orphaned. Even though he was still alive, Mark had become a shadow of the person he used to be because of his shame and the consequences of his decisions. And suddenly the main suspect in a murder that would follow them all for the rest of their lives was Lila, the lady who had been a member of their family. One thing was definite, but it was unclear what would happen next. The terrible end of the consequences from Mark and Lila's illegal romance had arrived. Lila Carter slipped like a shadow through the hands of law enforcement for 4 months. Every news channel featured her name and face when she vanished on March 12, 2012, sparking a nationwide manhunt. Investigators found evidence that she had been evading authorities by living off cash, using fictitious identification, and moving between small communities on a regular basis. The case began when a Border Patrol agent at the Canadian border saw a woman anxiously waiting to pass on July 20, 2012. She looked very different. She had lost a good deal of weight, and her once vibrant auburn hair had turned a dismal brown. Her haunted and restless eyes, however, were what revealed her identity. Lila tried to escape by running across the checkpoint after her phony identification failed to pass scrutiny. She did not get very far. Following a short pursuit, she was subdued and tackled to the ground. Officers discovered a counterfeit passport, a journal with unsettling remarks concerning Mark and Susan, and a sizable quantity of cash in her purse. A lot of the postings talked about the desire of seeing Mark again after Susan was taken away. Lila was charged with first-degree murder after being extradited to Alabama right away. Susan's distraught family and a small, shattered village that had been terrified of what she could do next were relieved that she had been arrested. Lila Carter's trial, which attracted global attention, started in early 2013. The hearings, which took place in the Jefferson County Courthouse, were characterized by a blend of intense emotion and quiet contemplation. Every day, the courtroom was crowded with neighborhood people who were hungry for justice to be done. Under the leadership of Assistant District Attorney Carolyn Weaver, a seasoned litigator renowned for her methodical approach, the prosecution made a compelling case. Weaver portrayed Lila as a cunning and violent individual who killed Susan out of jealous wrath because of her fixation with Mark. She gave Susan a chronology of events backed up by incriminating evidence, voicemails, and texts from Lila, some of which included subliminal threats. DNA and fingerprints are examples of forensic evidence that connects Lila to the scene of the crime. According to a number of eyewitness reports, Lila was close to the Wallace residence early on March 6, 2012. Additionally, Weaver drew attention to Lila's unsettling journal entries, which showed a pattern of compulsive and hallucinogenic thinking. Lila spoke of removing barriers to their happiness and referred to herself as Mark's one true love in these pages. Under the leadership of attorney Paul Grayson, the defense contended that Lila's behavior was the consequence of emotional upheaval and mental instability. Grayson said she was in a desperate situation because of her difficult childhood and her poisonous connection with Mark. He attempted to place the blame on Mark, suggesting that his duplicity and manipulation were major factors in the circumstances surrounding Susan's passing. Mark Wallace's testimony was one of the trial's most poignant moments. In addition to being crucial to the prosecution's case, his testimony served as a catalyst for his own introspection. Mark revealed the depth of his treachery and his grief over what had occurred to Susan by going into agonizing detail about his affair with Lila. He talked about how he had attempted to break off contact with Lila in the months before the murder but had misjudged the intensity of her devotion. He described how Lila had tormented Susan and wouldn't end their relationship, portraying her as cunning and unyielding. Mark's voice trembled as he apologized for his infidelity and the part he thought it played in Susan's demise. He insisted that he never thought Lila would use violence, but he refrained from accepting direct responsibility. In addition to being a pivotal moment in the trial that further influenced the jury's verdict of conviction, his testimony portrayed Mark as a tragic and profoundly damaged individual whose self-centered choices had devastated the life of his children and the woman he loved. Following 2 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision on March 15, 2013. Lila Carter's conviction for first-degree murder was upheld. A mixture of relief and muted joy erupted throughout the courtroom. As the decision was read, Susan's family, who had attended the trial every day, broke down in tears. The judge harshly condemned Lila's acts during the sentence hearing on March 22, 2013, describing the murder as the ultimate betrayal of humanity and family. Lila received a life sentence without the chance of release. Even though her icy manner sent shivers through the courtroom, she remained impassive when the judgment was delivered. Following the trial, the community came together to support Susan's family, recalling her as a loving neighbor and mother whose life had been cruelly interrupted. In order to assist women who had suffered betrayal and adversity in rebuilding their lives, her parents created the Susan Wallace Memorial Scholarship. Feeling a great deal of shame, Mark sold the family house and left with his kids. He devoted his life to raising kids, promising to instill in them the value of moral rectitude and honesty. Even though he would never be able to forgive himself completely, he used his regret to help his children have a better future. Behind jail, Lila's existence devolved into a lonely one. She clung to the idea that she and Mark were destined to be together and refused to accept her remorse. Even while incarcerated, she dreamt of seeing them again, according to her journal, which was seized when she was arrested. This is a heartbreaking and terrifying tale of how unreported and unpunished crimes can result in a loved one's death. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and see another Acase's case where a grandma was involved in a double homicide after having an affair with 2 younger men. I'll see you in the upcoming video.